that little bottle. I wanted to cool it. Thank you. Gotta have my water. Well, hello, everyone.
You are on, so if you want to look around, you can.
Well, we were just looking into whether it's a smaller audience than usual this week, because I hear that there's a lot of that going around. But I have 40,000 people more on the lawn of my house here who come. So I'm just saying.
Refrigerator, freezer.
I have my water. So our subject this week is the destruction and rebuilding of the temple. And I'd like to use Shalom Paul's old joke about Herod was a Jew who had an edifice complex, except I think I used the edifice complex joke in some earlier episode of this. So that's going to be a problem, folks, as the season rolls on. I'm going to forget which jokes I told already. And the only way to check that is then I'd have to watch through all of those past ones again. And there's no way on earth I don't want to watch me again. I know what I say, but I know who I am. Yeah. So, and it could be that a lot of you just reserved to be here today, but then aren't going to show up. I heard that's been happening in some places. But that's enough of trying to be relevant, you know.
Political.
And never political. I want to be clear. My wife just said political. Don't listen to her. When you hear those little comments on the side, if she laughs, that's good. If she makes a comment, you know, that's not, I don't do political very much, except ancient politics, Israel politics. We'll get into that plenty, even today. This concerns the destruction and rebuilding of the temple. So the first question is, which temple? So first of all, I mean the biblical times temple, not your local shul. And, you know, I'm living here in Athens, Georgia, and just down the road is Atlanta, Georgia, where there's a big synagogue that is called just the Temple. That's the name of it. So people here could especially get confused. So I'm referring to the BCE temples, not any of the CE ones. And even then you say, well, which temple? And if I would say the first or the second temple, most people automatically assume from that what is meant is the first and second temple in Jerusalem. But that's already wrong, because the two temples in Jerusalem weren't the first and second temple, right? It's explicit in the Bible that the first temple was at Shiloh, a city in the northern part of Israel. It's explicit in the book of Joshua that when the Israelites first come there, they set up the tent of meeting in Shiloh. And in Psalm 78, it's a psalm that takes place much later. It's after the temple has been destroyed. It says, God rejected the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent he pitched among humans. So both at the beginning and the end of the story, we understand that prior to the temple, you know, there was the Jews, the Israelites used to have a less permanent structure, a tabernacle. And, but all the other references to this place of worship, the central place of worship of Israel for a long time, was at Shiloh. And all these other references refer to it as either a temple, which is Hebrew a heichal, or a building, which is Hebrew a bayit. So in the book of Judges, in Judges 18, it refers to the house of God in Shiloh. Beit Yahweh is Shiloh. And in 1 Samuel 7, it says Beit Yahweh, referring to the place in Shiloh. In 1 Samuel 9, it refers to the doorpost of the heichal of Yahweh. A doorpost, and that's the Hebrew word mezuzah, because nowadays we think of a mezuzah as the thing that you put on the doorpost. But a mezuzah means a doorpost, and tents don't normally have a doorpost. They have a canvas post. You know? So In 1 Samuel 24, there's a reference to the house of Yahweh at Shiloh. If you look in the Dead Sea Scroll of that text, it has it exactly the same. In 1 Samuel 3, it refers to the Heichal Yahweh, the temple of Yahweh, which is also there. When the Israelites go into battle, they take the ark, which is located there in that structure, and they take it out to battle with them. I mean, it goes on like that. In 1 Samuel 3, it says he opened the doors of the house of Yahweh. This still doesn't sound like a tent. It sounds like a building. There are priests, sacrifices, incense, and the ark there. And it says explicitly in 1 Samuel 3, the Lord appeared there. And later in the time of Jeremiah, when Jeremiah is predicting the fall of the temple in Jerusalem, he says, it'll be like what happened to my temple that was in Shiloh. So everybody in biblical times had heard of Shiloh, and they knew that there was a temple there, and it was destroyed. And we don't know when or by whom. It's almost certainly by the Philistines, who would have been the powerful enemy at that time, but it never actually says who destroyed the first temple. So its fate is still unlearned. That was a song in my earlier years. So let's get to the second temple. The second temple is the first Jerusalem temple. This is the Temple of Solomon. Solomon's building gets tremendous detail in the Bible. Very few people want to read it. It gets into cubits. Most people, you see the word cubit, you flip a page or two and see if you can get past that. And but we know about the Temple of Solomon. It gives a description of it and the details and all. If you look in 1 Kings 6, it's a long, long chapter with all this architectural description of the building. It's not a big building. People misunderstand that about biblical temples. It's 20 cubits wide by 60 cubits long. A cubit, right, is elbow to second knuckle. It's 18 inches. So 20 cubits wide, right, 30 feet wide by 60 cubits long, 90 feet long. That's not a tremendous temple. I mean, there's hardly a synagogue in the country that's that small. And that was okay, though, because people didn't go in. In the biblical temple, only priests were allowed to go in. If you were a non-priest and you entered the temple, they killed you. No trial, no questions, because there's no explanation that could possibly make it okay. You've committed a ritual offense. You just can't be in there. The services, the prayers, the singing the psalms, the sacrifice of the animals, the incense, all of that was outside at the entrance to the temple where the people gathered out in the courtyard. And you can do that most of the time in Israel because the weather's good enough. And that's why the Jews come from Israel, not Poland, because they tried it there and it, you know. So there's all this detail about the temple. And still then you say, yeah, but what about the tent? There's this tradition that there'd been a tent out in the wilderness with Moses, and then it was there apparently at Shiloh. So either it's standing alongside the building in Shiloh, or they folded it up very neatly inside, or it was actually standing inside, which is what I think is what was going on there. And I did evidence, it was in my PhD dissertation, that the tabernacle was also in the second temple, meaning the first Jerusalem temple, where it's explicit. In 1 Kings 8:4, it says, on the day they dedicated the temple, they brought up the ark and the tabernacle and they put it there. Despite the fact that it says it explicitly there in the Book of Kings, and it says the exact same words explicitly in the Book of Chronicles, everybody in biblical scholarship except one thinks that there never really was a tabernacle inside the first temple. It's fun being the only one who's right. You know, you got, you know, it's for the ego, you know. And so when the first temple was destroyed, there's a reference to the tabernacle being destroyed in there too. They say that they burnt your name's tabernacle to the ground. So who did that? So you say, okay, we don't know who destroyed the first temple. We think probably the Philistines. Who destroyed the second temple? You ask anybody, and they say it was the Babylonians, right? Now, where do we get that? And given that the principle of this whole series that you've been watching, if you've been with me from the beginning, is the principle of the Firesign Theater comedy group, which is everything you know is wrong. So we all know that the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. We're all wrong. So let's try to figure out who destroyed the first temple. In 2 Kings 25, it's at the end of the book of 2 Kings, right? So we've gone through this whole story from creation to the end of the monarchy, and now the king's been captured and the Babylonians are winning. And here's what it says about what happened by Nebuzaradan, who was the head of the Babylonian army. And he burned the house of Yahweh, explicit, and the house of the king. So he burnt the temple, he burnt the palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and every big building he burned in fire. And the walls of Jerusalem all around, all the army of the Chaldeans as Babylonians, that the commander had broke them down. Okay, so that's pretty clear and explicit. The text says it was the Babylonians under their head general working for King Nebuchadnezzar that did the temple and the palace and the walls. So why am I fighting that? Well, there's another place where it tells about the destruction of the temple. To be clear, there are 4 places where it tells about it. The second one is the end of the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is 52 chapters long, and the 52nd chapter you look at, it's not like the rest of the book. It's not by Jeremiah or about Jeremiah. It's almost word for word that same chapter that we just read at the end of Kings. It was the main event that happened that time, so they put it at the end of the book of Jeremiah also. So if you read it there, it is word for word the same. He burned the house of Yahweh and the house of the king and all the houses of Jerusalem and every big building in fire and all the walls of Jerusalem they broke down all around. Okay. Now there's a third witness to what happened, and that's the Book of Chronicles. Chronicles tells a lot of the same history that the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Samuel tell, but it's often a bit different and sometimes identical. On this one, it says, and they burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all its palaces in fire. You notice in Chronicles, they don't bother with the king. And in general, in Chronicles, they care less about the kings. They care about priests and temples. And they say it was burned down too. Now, if I have 3 different sources in the Bible that say it was the Babylonians who destroyed the temple, and Jews ever since have said it was the Babylonians who destroyed the temple, what's the problem here? There is a 4th version of what happened, and it's the complete version. Each of the versions I read you are only 1 or at most 2 verses long, just being, they did this, they did this, they did this, they did this. Jeremiah, remember, who's a prophet there, he's walking the streets at the time, and he knows about this, and whoever is writing the history in the book of Jeremiah knows about this. Now listen very carefully. Here's Jeremiah 36:19. And here's the verse saying what happened that day. And they burned, what did I say? Not 30, Jeremiah, I gave you the wrong verse numbers. Some of you I see might be looking down there. Jeremiah 39:8. And the Chaldeans burned in fire the house of the king and the houses of the people, and they broke down the walls of Jerusalem. What's missing? Why does it not mention that they destroyed the temple? It just mentions they killed the palace. Sure, the king had rebelled. They burned down the palace and the big houses of the people, and they broke down the walls of Jerusalem, sure, to make Jerusalem defenseless, but nothing about the temple. So what do scholars do with this? You see, scholars, we're very clever guys, so, and gals. And the way scholars have always read why the temple isn't mentioned there is they say that this is a problem that you have, if any of you have ever done this, you're copying over a paper, you did a first draft and now you're doing the second draft. And when you do the second draft, the same word occurs twice nearby itself, and your eye reading it jumps to the second one. So when you copy it, you leave out whatever was written in between, right? You know that one? If you read, he gave a good lecture, and while he gave the lecture, he did such and such. And then somebody else is copying that over. They would say, he gave a good lecture and did such and such. And all the words that appeared in between the two occurrences of lecture get lost because the eye jumps when you're copying. You look down, you look up, you look down, and you miss. This is the single most common scribal error, and it has a name. It's called a haplography. I'm sure you all wanted to know that. A haplography is when you leave something out. Now, the other most common scribal error is when you mistakenly write a word twice. You know, when you wrote the word, and then you go on and you repeat it. So that's called a dittography, like ditto, because you did it again. The good news is when you make a dittography, usually we can figure out that the scribe made a dittography because it's two words where it doesn't make any sense. Occasionally it's a dittography and you're not really sure, but usually you can see it. But a haplography, how are you supposed to see what's not there? So there are haplographies all over the Bible. That means there are words of the Bible and we don't know that they're words of the Bible because the scribe went whoop and left them out. I have to digress on this for a moment because a friend of mine wrote to me today because Michael Drosnin died this week. He was this guy who wrote that book called The Bible Code that was big back in, when was it, the 1980s, 90s? I've lived too long. It was a book based on the research, I can't call it research, the activity of some rabbis of the Orthodox persuasion who put out the whole text of the Bible and entered it into machine readable copy in a computer. And then they would count and look for like every fifth letter of the Torah to see if you got something interesting doing that. And if that didn't work, they'd try, okay, every sixth letter of the Torah, and they'd do that. And then they lay all this out. And then sometimes they would find one of these crosses a line of actual text. So that's where you're not doing every other letter, you're just doing the letters as they are, but they're also crossing letters where you're doing every sixth or seventh, whichever worked, because you tried them all, and do that. Sometimes they do it backwards. If you lay out all the letters this way, and then you go up this way. They did diagonals. Now, 1997, my research department says this came out. And now, those of you who know math, you know that this stuff just will happen naturally, that when you count up letters like that, and especially in Hebrew, because Hebrew, you just put in the consonants, not the vowels, so you can fill in whatever vowels you need to make it work. And so a lot of people criticize this as really showing nothing, whereas these people are claiming they found messages, there were references to Hitler, and there were references to America, and all kinds of stuff in the Bible by counting the letters in the Bible code. And so the response they gave to someone who criticized them was, well, if you could make this work on Moby Dick, too, then we believe that, it's just something that happens. So these two mathematicians did it with Moby Dick, to show that it worked. Those of us in the Bible field knew better, though, because I just told you that the most common scribal error in the Bible is a haplography. Where there's a haplography, you lose anywhere from 2 to 50 letters where the scribe's eye jumped. So if you're counting letters, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work at all. This whole system can only work if we actually had the original manuscript of the Bible from then, and we don't, and it doesn't exist. So it will never happen. So I'm sorry. When people would ask me about it back in the 90s, I would say, oh yeah, no, I know about that. It works. If you count every 17th letter of the Torah, it says Paul McCartney is dead, you know? But this is not Torah, and it's kind of insulting to the Torah that, from my point of view, that the biggest focus isn't on what it says, but on secret codes that were placed there. Anyway, I mention it now because haplography, which wrecks that entire game, is the single most common mistake that scribes make, as it's the single most common mistake that students of mine make when they write papers, you know, and I mean, it's just what you do. Okay. Now, what should we do this though now? It says it leaves out the destruction of the temple. So what the scholars are doing is they're saying there must be a haplography here, right? Because if the original said they burnt down, ready? Beit Yahweh uVeit HaMelech, the house of Yahweh and the house of the king. And then the scribe is copying it over. The scribe's eye jumps from Beit to Beit, from house of to house of. So it said for the house of God and the house of the king, and the scribe just goes, the house of the king, and keeps going and leaves it out. So that's how they explain that. Now, I admit haplography is a very common thing, but you got to admit, as haplographies go, leaving out the destruction of the temple is kind of a biggie, that you wouldn't think a scribe would make such a mistake, and that if a scribe did make that mistake, the next scribe who's copying it over would catch the mistake. You know, always put in a little caret and say, and the, you know, and put it in. So to me, we need a better explanation than the usual one to explain why it would leave out the destruction of the temple. I'm admitting that it's possible that that's the reason why. And I never forget the lesson I learned from my great teacher, Professor Cross, who said, the most banal explanation is usually the correct one, which in this case would be just this graphic one. Except there's more on this. It says that 2 chapters later in Jeremiah 41, the Babylonians have won, they've left, they've carried off the king and the prisoners, and they've left most of the people there. We always picture the Babylonian exile as if all the Jews went off to Babylonia. Now, only a small percentage went off to Babylonia. Most of the Jews were still there. The whole army was still there. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the world, appoints Gedaliah as the governor of the Jews. So instead of a king, now they'll just have a governor. But there's still some members of the royal family who really don't like this. They want a descendant of King David on the throne. They don't want no governor appointed by a Babylonian emperor. And so they assassinated Gedaliah. And you know, to this day, the date of the assassination of Gedaliah is considered a fast day on the Jewish calendar. Now, it says they've assassinated Gedaliah and the assassins are riding off, okay? All of the assassins, Bourne and Anna and Bond, and are you with me on any of this? Red Sparrow, all the assassins. I watched too many movies. All the assassins, they're riding off and they've just killed Gedaliah. And it says on the way north, they bump into a group of people who are coming from Shechem, Shiloh, and Shomron. From Shiloh, Shechem, and Samaria, 3 cities that all begin with a shin. And I don't know if that was intentional or not, but you know, there's a lot of shin cities in Hebrew. And they bump into 80 people coming. And it says the 80 people are there who are coming in mourning and bringing sacrifices to bring to the temple, the house of Yahweh. Now, this is 2 months after the Babylonians have left. And it's 2 months later. It says it was in the 7th month, but we know the end is, you know, Tisha B'Av. Av is the 5th month. So this is the 7th month, and people are coming to bring sacrifices to the temple. Now I ask you, why is anybody bringing sacrifices to the temple if the temple was destroyed 2 months before this? And the usual answer to this is, well, After the temple was destroyed, Jews would still come and they erected an altar and they would still offer sacrifices on the site of the temple. And what is the evidence that the Jews erected an altar and would offer sacrifices on the site of the temple? This verse, that these guys are still coming to Jerusalem. But that's just answering the question with the question. We have no idea that, we have no reason to think that people thought that they could just offer sacrifices without a temple. And in fact, it never happened again for the rest of Jewish history to the present day. Well, I mean, until they built a second temple, and then after that one was destroyed till the present day. So, what should we make of this? If the Babylonians didn't destroy the temple, if it was still standing and people were bringing sacrifices to it 2 months later, who destroyed the temple? I just happen to have with me Psalm 137. Psalm 137 is one of the most famous Psalms in the Bible. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Also we wept when we remembered Zion. It's one of the most famous ones. They made a reggae song of it. By the rivers of Babylon. You can find it if you go see the movie, The Harder They Come, Jimmy Cliff, it's in that movie. And it's a horrible, horrible psalm. It's obviously about the destruction. And at the end though, it's when it's saying the most terrible things about the Babylonians, it throws in the following line in verse 7. Remember, Yahweh, the Edomites, the children of Edom, with the day of Jerusalem, who said, tear it up to its foundation. And you go, Edomites, what are they doing there? Edom is the country right next to Judah, right? If you go in Jerusalem or drive through the Negev at all in Israel today, and you look east to Jordan, southern Jordan, that's Edom. And until recently, it hadn't been excavated, but now it has by my old colleague from California, Tom Levy. And we've got Edom. And the Jews and the Edomites, for most of their history, did not have a good relationship. The Edomites are supposed to be the descendants of Esau in the story, and the Jews and Israelites are the descendants of Jacob. So on the one hand, a story like that tells you that we feel very close to the Edomites, like we're descended from twin brothers. And on the other hand, it means we have a little sibling rivalry problem with the Edomites. And so there's often pretty terrible conflict between the two. So in the Book of Lamentations, which is about the fall of Jerusalem and the temple, it explicitly criticizes the Edomites in verse 21. In the Book of Obadiah, which is the only one chapter book of the Bible, and it's all about the destruction and the end, and it has 4 verses, verses 11 to 14, which say the same thing. It's against Edomites. In Ezekiel 25, a prophet who was like one of the main prophets at that period, and he refers to it too. So why do they all have these Edomites having something to do with the destruction of the temple? I mean, they're right across the river. And then there's this one more verse I can give you, which is or isn't in your Bible, depending on what your religion is. It's from the book of First Esdras, or also known as Third Ezra, which is in the, the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's in their Bible. It's not in the Catholic Bible, and it's not in the Jewish Bible, this extra book, the book of First Esdras. Probably didn't make it into our Bible because it's in Greek, not Hebrew. And in it, when the Jews come back to rebuild their land, they're led by a man named Zerubbabel. In Hebrew, it's Zerubbabel, which sounds fine, but in English, it sounds like a brand of gum, Zerubbabel. But Zerubbabel is like one of the last, if not the last known name in the house of David. He's a descendant of the kings. And he is talking to Darius, the Persian emperor. And he says, ready? you also vowed to build the temple that the Edomites burned when Judah was laid waste by the Chaldeans. It's explicit that when the Babylonians laid waste to Jerusalem, it was the Edomites who burned the temple. Now, what should we do with that? And the scholars have all seen that passage. One of them refers to it, a guy writing about that writes, it is the most explicit and probably least accurate reference to Edomite behavior in 587 BCE. And you go, why? It's the most explicit, but also wrong, he said. He also says that when Kings and Chronicles already tell us explicitly that it was the Chaldeans, the Babylonians who did it, he says, their witness must surely be followed. Well, I'm sorry, Shirley, but I'm the one who told you all just a little while ago that we don't follow their witness because the more complete version is the one in Jeremiah. Now, you might say, but wait, if the Jeremiah version is right, that months went by and the temple was still standing, and then later the temple got destroyed by the Edomites. So Edomites, why do Kings and Chronicles say that the Babylonians did it? Because they're giving the one-sentence version of it. If I give you the one-sentence version of the Revolutionary War in the United States, I say, well, you know, they dumped the tea in the harbor, and the British came with their army, and Washington crossed the Delaware with his forces on Christmas and defeated these Hessian soldiers who were working for the British Army, and then we got our independence, let freedom ring. Now, I just took years of history and collapsed it into a sentence, because that's what you do when you do that. You tell, you know, the Civil War, well, there's the North and there was the South, and there, you know, and you get through it. And I think that's all that happened in Kings and Chronicles. They just collapsed it. They said, yeah, they destroyed the temple, they destroyed the palace, they broke the walls. Yeah, it was a bad year. But in fact, when you look at the more complete version, that's not exactly how it happened. The destruction of the temple was a separate event from the destruction of Jerusalem. So, well, I have to give it the last sentence of that guy who wrote the article that, you know, we just have to accept those shorter versions. He said, for the destruction of Jerusalem and Judah in 587 BC, Edom cannot be held in any way responsible. The prophets and many of their less critical followers owe Edom an apology. Well, folks, we owe Edom an apology. So, I mean, we know that we all live in the age of the non-apology apology. So I'm willing to make one of those non-apology apologies that you know, politicians make. So if anything I've said was taken as an offense by any Edomites, I'm sorry that they took offense at what I said, and it was not my intention. Okay, are we good? So now I've apologized to the Edomites, but you know, now what are the other views among scholars, you know, more scholarly comments on this? Many scholars say that the Jews, when they came later and rebuilt Jerusalem and built a second, meaning the third temple there in Jerusalem, that they, at that time, they had such hostility to the Edomites that they made up this story in retrospect, pinning bad things on the Edomites, because we hated the Edomites, so we pinned this thing on them. Now, what is the evidence for this claim? None. There's no reason to think they did that. But, you know, better would be the archaeological evidence. And in this case, it's the absence of, and you know, there's this old line in archaeology that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So they say there's no evidence of any Edomite presence in the destruction of Jerusalem. You go, well, what would that be? They say, well, for example, Edomite arrowheads, which were distinct from other people's arrowheads. And you're like, okay, fair argument. That's true. There aren't any Edomite arrowheads, except the claim isn't that the Edomites were involved in the battle or that they fought against the Jews or anything. It's that after the destruction of the temple, the Edomites came, I mean, the destruction of the city, and the Babylonians carried off the king and all that. Then the Edomites came and they burned down the temple. You don't need arrows to burn down a temple. So what possible evidence would you get unless you got like, a love letter from the general of the Edomites back to his wife across the river saying, we got those suckers, we burned their building down. I mean, that's just, what do they think they're going to find? And they know that it's a true Edomite general writing that because it says it's dated 587 BC. So they know. All right, time to get serious. So we rebuilt the temple. So now we're up to the third one, right? We have the Shiloh Temple, the Jerusalem Temple of Solomon, and now begins the second Jerusalem Temple that was built when the Babylonians freed the Jews from exile and allowed them to go back and rebuild their land. So many Jews stayed in Babylon, many Jews moved to Egypt, and many Jews moved back to Judah and lived there. So they built the third temple. And then an interesting question of law came up. It says in the book of the prophet Zechariah, the two main prophets during this period of rebuilding are the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. And Zechariah's there, and it says, well, they're finishing rebuilding the temple, and the Jews come to the temple, and they have a question that they put to the priests, the prophets, and everybody available. They're the Levites. And they say, do we have to keep Tisha B'Av? They said, do we have to keep fasting on our days of mourning? Because, we rebuilt the temple now. So should we stop doing that? And it turned out they were fasting on Tisha B'Av, which is the fast of the 5th month, and also 3 other fast days. You only fast half a day on those, so tasteless rabbinical students refer to those as half-fast days, but we won't go there. And the person who steps forward to answer their question is Zechariah. And here's what he said. When you fasted mourning in the 5th month and in the 7th month and 70 years now, did you fast for me? Me? And when you eat and when you drink, aren't you the eaters and you the drinkers? So you're one of the Jews in the street and you just heard this answer to your question. And you go, so we do fast or we don't? What was that answer? Now remember, when prophets give prophecies in the Bible, they speak in poetry. And that was, the chapter had been in prose, but now the answer that Zechariah gave him was poetry. Now many people have treated this like it's the first responsum, like you get in rabbinic literature. There's a little drop of blood in the egg of this chicken. Can I eat the chicken, or can I eat the egg, or can I not eat the egg? So you go to the rabbi and he says, well, was the drop of blood in the yolk, or was the drop of blood in the albumin? And can you get the drop of blood? In other words, when you go to a rabbi with a question, the rabbi gives you the law. So they treat this like it's that. But Zechariah is not a rabbi, he's a prophet. And it gives an answer in poetry. If you went to your rabbi now and you had a technical question of Jewish law and you asked the rabbi, and the rabbi gave you your answer in a limerick, would you be good with that? We don't want poetry on matters of law. So you look at those wordings. When you fasted in mourning now 70 years in the 5th month and in the 7th month, were you fasting to me? Me? And when you eat and when you drink, aren't you the eaters and you're the drinkers? And then he goes on and gives this history of the Jews and their land, and while they had gotten everything from God and everything was great, but then they kept messing up, and their kings were always breaking the laws, and they're always doing everything wrong, and you always think the prophets are like Jewish anti-Semites, they're always criticizing the Jews. And they say, you did all these things wrong, and then all these terrible things happened to you, and then the temple got destroyed, and you were all carried off into exile. And but then in exile, you were sorry, and you repented, and God has also relented and let you go back. So now, he says, you can rejoice. And so he says 4 times, the fast of the 4th month, 5th month, 7th month, and 10th month will become for the house of Judah joy and happiness and holidays, love, truth, and peace. So people have always taken this to mean that Zechariah abolished the fast days, Tisha B'Av and 3 others, and said, no, you don't have to follow those fast days anymore, and that those became holidays for the Jews. And that lasted from when they rebuilt the temple, that's like around 515 or so BC, well, I said 70 years, so it's 517 BCE, until the Romans destroyed the second temple in 70 CE. And that for all of those years, the Jews partied on Tisha B'Av and all those other holidays, and that when the second temple got destroyed, they reestablished the old fast days because now they lost their temple again. So that's a really interesting question, isn't it? In fact, it came up in my lifetime. I was doing my junior year of college in Israel in 1967, and so all of some American students were there for the Six-Day War. And when we got back to the States, we heard people asking that question. They said, now that we've reacquired the old city and the Temple Mount, and all of that is in Jewish hands again, do we have to observe Tisha B'Av or not? It may not come as a big surprise to you that all the rabbis will know you still got to observe Tisha B'Av. But the question was a valid question to ask and answer, just as it had been all those hundreds of years earlier. And everybody took it to mean that he said, yeah, those holidays, they're party now, and they made them fast days again later. Now, that's kind of hard to believe on the face of it. And in fact, there's some evidence in the Talmud that, remember, I always tell you I don't do AD, here it comes. In the Talmud, there are passages that indicate that they did observe Tisha B'Av and the other holidays during all those years. They were still mourning the destruction of that temple, even after they rebuilt a new one there. One of them, this gets a little technical, but join me, it's Talmud. You know, Talmud gets technical, but it's always kind of interesting. There's a rabbi whose name is Rabbi Eliezer ben Zadok. Now, with that name, Eliezer ben Zadok, it means he's a Zaydokite. It means he's also a priest as well as a rabbi. He's from the old Kohen family. And it turns out, and he says, I'm a member of the priestly family Sina'ah. And you go, okay, that's fascinating. We didn't know that. There were several priestly families, and they all divided up the year so that they would take turns having a day that they were responsible to bring the wood and the necessary items for the sacrifices at the temple. And each family that had their one date in the year, that was the date where they had to bring enough wood to last a long time. And when they did that, that was their family's personal holiday. And he says, I'm from the family Sina'ah, and our personal holiday was the 10th of Av. And he says, you know, I remember one year, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, fell on Shabbat. Well, we thought you can't observe Tisha B'Av on Shabbat. You know, they don't do a fast day on Shabbat. So the tradition, you know, to this day is if Tisha B'Av falls on the Sabbath, you bump it and you observe it the next day on Sunday. So he said, I remember one year it fell on Shabbat, Tisha B'Av. So they were going to observe Tisha B'Av on the 10th of Av. But that was my priestly family's holiday. And we were supposed to be celebrating that day. So how could we be celebrating and mourning on the same day? So he said, we celebrated, but only for half the day. But the point is that they were still observing Tisha B'Av there still while the second temple was standing. So what shall we do with all this? They rebuild the temple. They start enjoying life being Jews again. And everything worked fine until the Romans came a long time later in the year 70 and destroyed the second temple. So let me just go out with this last question then. Should we build a fourth one? Should we rebuild the temple speedily and in our day? You may each have your answer to that. Pencils ready? I have my answer. Yes, I think we should rebuild the temple, and the sooner the better. Now, there are the usual objections that people raise when you say you're in favor of rebuilding the temple. The first one is location. location. They say, in case you haven't noticed, there's a mosque on the site now. So what are you going to do that? And then you argue about, well, what should we do about the fact that there's a mosque on the site? And my answer is, so build it on another site. There's nothing in the Bible that says where the temple has to be built, except that it has to be in Israel. You can put it anywhere in Israel. Put it in Eilat. Put it in Haifa. It's lovely up there. There's no reason. They could put it back in Shiloh. That would be interesting. At least it's got history. Put it in Jerusalem, but not up there on the Temple Mount. Find it there. It's a big city. Put it somewhere else. So yeah, I don't see location being a question whatsoever to building a new temple, but building it in Israel. But then the second question people always raise is, but what are we going to do there? Are we going to have sacrifices? We don't want to do sacrifices. We Jews, we don't do sacrifices anymore. And I go, what's wrong with sacrifices? So I got two different answers here. The first answer is, what's wrong with sacrifices? Sacrifices were what they did in biblical times to make the killing of an animal a ritual thing done at a temple by a priest, not the way we do it now, where it's done in a horrible butcher's yard in a way that most of us have never seen and don't ever want to see as long as we live. So it was done in a sacred, respectful way of the life of an animal. And that was the only way you could eat meat, is if it was done that way. So my first answer is, yeah, if we can get ourselves into that state of mind to remember again that we were taking life when we killed an animal, and we didn't just get it wrapped up in plastic where it doesn't even look what animal it was anymore, the way we modern civilized people do it. Maybe we learned something from that. Alternatively, I could say, no, really, we're not ready to go back to that. We're not going to do ritual celebrations of killing the animal, and it's just not going to work. So, okay, what else might we do if we rebuild the temple? I would say, for someone, it should be for everyone who truly craves peace to come there. It'd be a place where there's music, especially psalms, which are the very songs that were sung in the old temple, and make it a center for learning, especially the Bible that you may recall was written in that country back then. It'd be a place of learning, a place of music, a place of prayer, a place of study, and a place that's a world center for peace where everybody's invited to come. Why not? So, okay, there you go. I've given you 4 temples. If you're happy with Shiloh, I'm sorry it's gone. The 2 in Jerusalem are gone. But there's no reason why we couldn't build a new one now. Now, of course, you're going to ask, who's going to be in charge there? And that one I think we'll save for another day. No politics here. Okay, everybody, are we done? I will see you next time.
Okay. See you next time.
If anybody wants to ask something, I don't know if this time.
Yeah, if somebody wants to ask a question, they can put their virtual hand up and we can call on them, or put their question in the chat. There was a question in the chat whether there's archaeological evidence about the Edomite destruction.
No, there is no evidence for or against, though. As I said, the absence of arrowheads doesn't prove anything. So there's no evidence, archaeological evidence, for or against the Edomites doing it. There's textual evidence. It's explicit in the Bible. I mean, what do you want? Yeah.
And there's another question whether there's kind of a reason to imagine that the Babylonians might have destroyed Jerusalem without destroying the temple. Like, was that something that was done?
Sure, why not? Look, they destroyed the palace because the king had betrayed them. They didn't just destroy the palace, they lined up his sons in front of him and executed all of his children in front of him, and then they put out his eyes. And then they led him in chains back to Babylon. It's the king that they were really mad at. When you're a king, you do not rebel against Nebuchadnezzar, at least not twice. And so they got him, and they destroyed the walls of Jerusalem. Yeah, because that makes it defenseless. And they burned down a lot of the big houses because they were carrying off the upper class. That's who they wanted. But the temple hadn't rebelled against them. We don't know if the priests were in it. So yeah, I can see them not burning down the temple. It was pretty, And I could see them stripping it, taking the ark or cherubs. I mean, there's a lot of gold stuff in there. So I could see them looting it, but there was no reason to destroy the building.
There's another question here, if I'm interpreting it correctly. The question, I think, is asking whether animals that were sacrificed or killed at the temple, were those the only kinds of meat that people could eat, that Jews could legitimately eat, or was that something that only the priests wanted and that actually people could sacrifice or could slaughter animals at home?
It depends on if you're a Levitical kind of guy or a Deuteronomic kind of guy. According to the book of Leviticus, you can't eat an animal, meaning a main domestic animal, meaning anything of the bovine family, cows, oxen, water buffaloes, bisons, or of the sheep and goat family. Any of those, you can't eat them unless they're killed properly at this ritual place at the temple and nowhere else, with the incense burning and the priests doing it. And it says if you do it anywhere else, it kill the animal, like, in Haifa, then it's as if you have spilled blood. And it's the term that's used for spilling human blood. It's like murder if you kill an animal in this non-ritual way. Now that's according to Leviticus. But then the book of Deuteronomy comes along and it gives you a dispensation. It says in Deuteronomy 12, if you live too far from the central place and you can't get there, you want lamb chops for dinner and you live in Haifa and you don't want to go all the way to Jerusalem to eat your darn lamb chop, it says you can kill the lamb in Haifa, but you have to pour off some of the blood. You have to do a little ritual instead. It is only because of that dispensation in Deuteronomy that we Jews are allowed to eat meat ever since then. If we only had Leviticus and not that line in Deuteronomy, then Jews would all have had to be vegetarians for the last 2,000 years because we didn't have a temple. So there you go. I have friends who are vegetarian. They're going, yeah, well, that would have been better. But anyway, that's how that one played out. So yeah,
So we should blame Deuteronomy if we have any kind of heart disease.
Yeah. We used to say there's a deli in New York that's killed more Jews than the Europeans did. It's it's terrible, I know. But that's why we were allowed to eat meat. Now there were exceptions anyway, because we were still allowed to hunt. Jews were always allowed to hunt. So you could have an antelope or other wild animals if they were, had a split hoof and chew their cud, which is the whole deer family, antelope family, all of those, bull moose, those are okay. Caribou, it's very good. You can eat those just by hunting them because you can't drag them to the temple and sacrifice them. And all birds are a separate category too. Birds and fish don't count in this. This is only four-legged land animals. So you could still get your protein,
So the idea that we don't hunt, Jews don't hunt today, that's a rabbinical addition?
I guess, I don't know where that came from. It's absolutely explicit in the Bible that they hunt animals and eat them. Jacob's on, Isaac is on his deathbed and he asks his son Esau to go out and hunt him some food, a deer, and make him a dinner for his meal. And then he'll give him a blessing in God's name. What's that supposed to be? Sure, they hunted.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing against hunting. I have something against hunting because I've never hunted, but I don't really want to kill an animal. I will eat them.
And does anybody, if there are any other questions under the participants, if you click on participants at the very bottom, there's a little icon of a hand. And if you would like to press that, then I would know to unmute you.
A hand up earlier. Was that Andy? Was that you? And no?
I didn't see it.
Was this Rabbi Betsy Roth?
Oh,
What it says there. Did you make the American flag? Wasn't that Betsy? Oh, that was Betsy Ross. I'm sorry. I don't mean, I'm not making fun. I actually remembered Betsy Ross. So Betsy Ross is Ashkenazic, but in Sephardic, it's Betsy Roth, right?
good one.
Can you unmute yourself? Or?
Actually, I'm not sure that she can, and I'm not sure that I can, right? Oh, hold on. There. think I made it possible to, there you
There.
go.
Yes, I never heard that joke before.
They come to me, man. It's,
Well, I have a joke for you.
oh, good.
When we talked about Scribal slips, this came to me, this joke came to me, and you might use it. So there's this young man, a young monk, and he just graduated from seminary, and he was about to begin his studies, and he was going to, where he was going to study. And what you do when you get there, he knocks on the door, and one of the older monks who's lived there for many, many years opens up the door, and he goes, "Oh, yes, young man, we were expecting you. It's so good to see you, and welcome. And, you'll be here for the next, whatever years. But before you start your work here, there's a task you must do." And the young man said, "Certainly, I'm here to do anything. I'm honored to be here. Just let me know what you need me to do, and I'll do it." And the monk went, "Yes, what we do is we have our Bible, we have our ways, we have our Torah, our laws. And what you do as a young monk is you copy over this whole book. You copy it, you make an exact copy of it, and that adds to our library." So the young man is like, "This is great. No problem. I'm happy to do it. I even have good penmanship, whatever." So the older priest goes down into the basement, to the catacombs, and he's gone for an hour and 2 hours, 3 hours. And the young man, he's very concerned. So he decides to go down, and he goes down to the basement, to the libraries, to the far dark corners, and he sees the other monk sitting on the floor crying and crying and crying. And the young monk says to him, "Well, what's the matter? What's the matter?" And the older monk says, "It says celebrate."
Very nice. Very nice. That's a classic.
Bible slip.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I can match you at least. There is one that the Freudian slip. This really did happen. There was an edition of the Bible. This is really true. Put out in England, 17th century, in which it's a perfect Bible in all respects, except in the 10 Commandments, it says, "Thou shalt commit adultery." Now, this is true. I have seen it. And nobody knows if it was a mistake, a Freudian slip by the copyist, or if it was, there's something that's called a printer's mouse. This is like some kid who works in the printer's shop and sneaks in late at night and, adds dirty words and stuff like that to text. So it may have been a printer's mouse. It may have been a Freudian slip. I mean, we don't know what it was, but it said, but they printed hundreds of them and published them. And they were out there till somebody noticed. And then the publisher was fined a great deal of money, and they had to recall all of them and burn them. But like 6 copies have survived. And one of them is in New York. It's in a museum in New York. And somebody photographed that page and sent it to me. I don't know exactly what they were thinking. But I do have a copy of that page, and it really does. And it's known as the Wicked Bible. And it's the Bible that
That's funny.
a curious real life parallel to your joke,
There you go. Celebrate. Okay.
That's great.
Thank you.
Everybody,
All right, well, we'll celebrate another great lecture, and we'll be back next week with a topic of widows and widowers. So
Thank you.
we'll see you next week.
oh.
Boa tov.